Hi there, it's Marty Braden again. Our topic today is imaginary friend or God himself. I hope it would catch your curiosity. Before I share my thoughts on the topic, I need to mention that my Zoom call with my special guest Hannah Stoddard has been rescheduled due to circumstances out of her control. At the end of my last video, I had mentioned that my interview with her would be this coming Tuesday, but as I said, it's been postponed for a week, so be watching for the video when it comes out. Until then, I'm going to continue doing additional videos as I work to finish up reviewing the remaining subtitles and arguments from chapter 10 of my book, the last chapter of An Atheist Delusion. So I'm almost done with this particular project, but I'm still going to be doing some very unique videos in the future. Before I start, I'd also like to take a moment and explain to those of you who are watching this video for the very first time on my channel what the why is behind my videos, because I think it'll help you understand better what I'm trying to do with them. I'm confident that you're going to enjoy all of them, whatever ones you choose to watch, especially if you aren't that familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You might know us as the pejorative slang term called the Mormons. I, of course, prefer that you call me a Latter-day Saint. Anyway, I get all of my topics from a book I recently published titled An Atheist Delusion, a Latter-day Saints perspective, mine, on Richard Dawkins' anti-theist, anti-Christ book, The God Delusion. As you probably know, Richard is a world-renowned atheist and an evolutionary biologist. And as an atheist, he has a lack of faith in God's existence. But he does believe in the quasi-doctrine of evolution and its chief tenet, natural selection, which was born out of Charles Darwin's atheism or loss of faith in God. In the introduction to the God Delusion, Richard wrote, "The purpose for writing the God Delusion was to make atheists out of everyone who reads his book." Once I published my book, I decided to set up a channel, which I called An Atheist Delusion, but it's under the name Martin Braden-Author. My channel allows me to record and post short videos of me reviewing every single one of Richard's anti-theist, anti-Christ arguments that he put forth in his book. And so far I've posted 119 videos. The newest video you're watching now is part 120. Woohoo! And so with that said, let's pick it up where I left off last time, right here. A much needed gap. Richard introduces his last chapter by asking the question, does religion fill a much needed gap? He continues later, historically, religion aspired to explain our own existence and the nature of the universe in which we find ourselves. In this role, it is now completely superseded by science, he says, end quote. I would say this quite differently. I would say that scientists have tried to interpret the data that relates to our origin and have tried to explain how we and our universe came to be, and they're still trying to answer all of the other big questions as well, such as, is there life after death? What's our purpose as sentient beings living here on this globe called Earth, one tiny planet out of numberless planets in a vast, never-ending universe? And why is there a universe as opposed to nothing at all? And how did life begin? That's the origin. They've not even come close to figuring that one out. Richard saying science has completely superseded religion's explanation or interpretation of the data regarding all of the big questions about our universe and our place in it is going far beyond the mark, don't you think? Yes, scientists have discovered answers to many of the questions that mankind has sought answers to over the multiple millenniums of existence, but they have yet to understand the really big ones. The biggest question, of course, being, does God exist? It's my belief that God, in his infinite wisdom, has provided science its discoveries on a timeline he has directed. Richard continues, at one time religion has been thought to fill our four main roles in human life: explanation, exhortation, consolation, and inspiration. By exhortation, I mean mortal or moral instruction on how we ought to behave. Richard says these four roles, explanation, exhortation, consolation, and inspiration, are arguments that need to be filled in order to prove God's existence. And so Richard feels that any such evidence, as far as these four roles go, roles which theists say support God's existence, they must be disproved. Richard says he has dealt with explanation in chapter 4 and exhortation in chapter 5, 6, and 7. And so in this chapter, chapter 10, he is going to take upon himself the dealing with the remaining two, consolation and inspiration, end quote. Richard describes this gap as a much needed gap, or a psychological need for God, that believing theists should choose to fill with the imaginary friend theory. or the sky god. In response, he basically says, disregard your sky god and, quote, just fill it with my quasi-religion atheism, which is doctrine of evolution, and all that you are wanting will all be well. Of course, that's me putting words into Richard's mouth, which really isn't fair. So, as Richard sees it, the old age gap question, does God exist or not, is filled by believers with what he calls the imaginary friend theory. Until 2006, when Richard wrote The God Delusion, Richard felt that the questions he presents in chapter 10 hadn't really been objectively answered yet, and so in his mind, writing his book finally answered this much needed gap question. The gap being the human need to find purpose in their lives, as well as what the answers were to the big questions like, where did I come from? Why am I here? These are child's questions. And where am I going when I die, if there is life after death after all? All of mankind has felt the need to answer these much needed gap questions, each of them forming in the hearts and minds of all mankind. Richard claims to have answered them with his scientific guesses. Well, to me, it's as though Richard is saying that he and he alone has once and for all disproved the God hypothesis. He and he alone has done what all of science has never been able to do for millennia. I can hear him saying it to himself right now. I did it! I did it! I've answered all the gap questions, and it's not God, it's not God. It's evolution. It's Darwin's crane of natural selection. Atheism is right. Yippee! Ha ha ha! Hooray! Of course, Richard's never said this, but it sure seems it is what he is saying throughout his book, The God Delusion. I do appreciate Richard's mental strength and the confidence he's shown in sharing his reasoning behind his arguments regarding the big questions of life. In fact, I don't fault him for being so adamant about them either. I do have mental strength and confidence in my perspective on what I believe with all my heart and soul, which is that God does exist. I too am adamant about my table of belief stand that supports and stabilizes my table of belief. I'm just set aback at times by Richard's logic, however. A lot of it is sound and makes sense, of course, but then there's the times when Richard seems to become void of any common sense whatsoever when positing some of his outlandish theories, especially his big questions arguments. To me, many of Richard's arguments seems to have come from way out in left field. In other words, from La La Land. And this is why I believe I can say that Richard suffers from an atheist delusion. With that said, let's address Richard's first subtitle of this last chapter, chapter 10, of The God Delusion, it being the subtitle called Binker. This subtitle is a perfect example of why Richard cracks me up. You're going to love this chapter. You're going to be chuckling through it, and hopefully my perspective on it. As a preliminary to the first role of religion, consolation, Richard begins his subtitle of Binker by talking about Christopher Robin and his imaginary friends Winnie, the Pooh, and Binker. Richard believes Christopher's imaginary friends, Winnie the Pooh and Binker, have affinities with religious belief. After quoting from A. Milne's Now We Are Six book, Christopher Robin's description of his secret friend Binker, Richard says, I suspect that the Binker phenomenon of childhood may be a good model for understanding theistic belief in adults. Richard's scientific evolution believing atheistic mind cannot allow itself to wrap around how grown adults like me can believe in an unseen God. It's a companion and confidant, he says. A Binker for life is surely one role that God plays, one gap that might be left if God were to go. End quote. Richard then relates a story of a little girl and her imaginary purple man, and then gives this commentary on it. Quote, the story makes me almost tearful, he said, and it brings me as close as I shall probably come to understanding the consoling and counseling role of imaginary gods in people's lives. Perhaps even better than giving real comfort and good advice, imaginary friends and imaginary gods have the time and patience to devote all of their attention to the sufferer, and they are much cheaper than psychiatrists or professional counselors, end quote. Richard then, as always, reverts back to his answer for all the big questions, that answer being evolution, and asks, quote, did gods in their role as counselors and consolers evolve from Binkers by a sort of psychological metamorphosis? Metamorphosis being the retention into adulthood of childhood characteristics. It is a well-known pattern in evolution, widely accepted as important for the development of such human characteristics as our bulbous foreheads and short jaws. End quote. He continues, could religions have evolved originally by gradually postponement over generations of the moment in life when children have to give up their binkers, just as we slowed down during revolution, the flattening of our foreheads and the protrusion of our jaws, end quote. Wow, that's a good one, Richard. Amazing. You've convinced me. Evolution's true. Evolution's true. Not. I'm just kidding, of course, and trying to give validation and credibility to his Binker theory and its evolutionary pathology. Richard introduces psychologist Julian Jaynes and refers to Jaynes' book, which is titled The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. In it, Mr. Jaynes says, quote, many people perceive their own thought processes as a kind of dialogue between the self and another internal protagonist inside the head, end quote. In other words, Jaynes is suggesting that there are two main imaginary characters or voices going on in one's head. Sound familiar? Jaynes' suggestion that sometime before 1000 BC, people in general were unaware that the second voice, the Gilbert Penfold voice, came from within themselves. They thought the Penfold voice was a god, Apollo, say, or Astarte, or Yahweh, offering them advice or orders. The breakdown of the bicameral mind was, for Jaynes, a historical transition, end quote. Both Jaynes and Dawkins are saying that evolution was at play here. Jaynes even goes so far as to define this time of transition to two voices at battle with each other as the dawning of human consciousness. I'm not kidding. It's unreal. As an evolutionary biologist, Richard knows, as do most neurologists, that the nature of consciousness is problematic, in particular because of man's mental ability to introspect, to have awareness of oneself. Jaynes, like many neuroscientists, believes our ability to introspect must be distinguished by sensory awareness and other processes of cognition. And so he posits a solution to this problem by saying that consciousness is a learned behavior. Really? A learned behavior? Come on, man. He says it's based more on language and culture than on biology. This is just Jaynes' interpretation of things without offering any tested, irrefutable evidence. This solution that came into Jaynes' mind, of course he'd say into his wet brain, points to the origin of consciousness as having started in ancient human history, rather than to metaphysical processes. Furthermore, Jaynes believes, quote, archaeological and historical evidence indicates that prior to the so-called learning of consciousness, human mentality or intelligence was called the bicameral mind, a mentality based on verbal hallucination. There it is. Why do scientists, when they don't have an answer, say, well, it's just a hallucination? Richard's done it many times throughout the book. What? I just don't know what to think. I have to say, are you kidding me, Jaynes? Our consciousness is a hallucination? Anything that can be validated by naturalism is deemed, that cannot be validated by naturalism is deemed a hallucination. There's absolutely no scientific evidence or data from any scientific study that they can hold up in support of this theory. Again, this is just one scientist postulating a wild guess, in my opinion. I added this additional detail on Jaynes' writings since Richard chose not to. I wanted to make it clear that this theory of the bicameral mind being the launching point of man's consciousness is most definitely not settled science, as Jaynes and other scientists would have us believe. It is, in fact, a big guess on Jaynes' part. This goes for Richard's theorizing or guessing that the Binker phenomenon of childhood is supposedly a good model for understanding theistic belief in adults as well. Both of these postulates are just big fat guesses. They are wild examples of what I've been calling an atheist delusion. As you can see, supposedly highly intelligent individuals like Dawkins and Jaynes have an incredible ability to imagine a plethora of improbable theorems, most of them being outlandish and an affront to common sense. It's so interesting to me how the mind of scientists like Dawkins and Jaynes' minds work. To them, this is called doing science. They often get off track and forget to follow the scientific method for many of their theories, making it impossible for other scientists to duplicate their supposedly tested theories' results. With that said, I would like consider what Daniel C. Peterson, a former professor of Islamic Studies and Arabic in the Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages at Brigham Young University, and what he had to say about consciousness. The following excerpts are from a talk given by Dr. Peterson where he discusses secular arguments in support of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and in particular in support of the restored gospel as it is taught in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Here are those excerpts, and I quote, one other issue that I want to talk about is the whole issue of consciousness. We, meaning everybody, don't know what consciousness is. Now that's odd because consciousness is the thing we are most closely acquainted with. We know about our own consciousness. That's precisely the point. I can cut into somebody else's head. I can see how the brain functions. We can measure what parts of the brain fire up at certain points, but we cannot have the sense of what's going on in that head. My personal subjective experiences are mine. They're not yours. And I can never have yours, and you can never have mine. And we don't know what that means. Where did consciousness come from? Even if you create a really elaborate computer, is it conscious? And how would you even know? What's his name? The mathematician whose big the movie was just about him. Yeah, the Turing machine. You know, the Turing machine. You know the Turing machine problem? You could have something that behaves as if it's conscious, but how would you even know unless you can gain access to it? We don't know how to gain access to it. The whole question of intentionality. I had a dialogue with someone just yesterday, Dr. Peterson says. I have these dialogues all the time on the internet, but they're useful to me, he says. I learned what's going on out there, what's agitating the hive, if you will, and this fellow is saying, look, thought is nothing more than, and then he's quoting someone he probably doesn't know he is, but he's quoting it saying, but thought is something secreted by the brain in the same way that liver secretes bile, right? And it's just a chemical thing. I said, well then, why should I listen to you any more than I should listen to your toaster? He says, what does that mean? My toaster doesn't have thoughts. And I said, well, by your standards, neither do you. If thought is just a neurochemical event, a brain flatulence, then what is it? How can a neurochemical or an electrochemical event be about anything else? I mean, he may be thinking that he's thinking about the nature of the brain, but toasters aren't doing anything. I mean, physical events and physical objects aren't about anything else. If your brain, your liver, when it's secreting bile, that secretion is not about the planet Mars. The astronomer may be thinking he's thinking about the planet Mars, but if his brain is no different than his liver or his kidney, it's hard to know what that would even mean. Continuing, but the fact is, we know that we do think, okay? I mean, it's funny to me to see some philosophers of consciousness now saying consciousness is an illusion. See what I said? Well then, who's having the illusion? What in the world are you talking about? Then Mr. Peterson wrote, Albert Einstein said that the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. Why in the world does it make sense? And John Lennox talks about this on several videos. I have it on my website under my playlist. He talks about the just the idea that scientists knew they could go to the universe and come up with math and have it relate perfectly to what's going on in the universe, describing the universe down the large to the small, and it was able to comprehend it through this process because of laws and studying of laws. And why? Because they knew that there was a lawgiver of the universe and there'd be laws found in it. That's why it's comprehensible. Anyhow, I go off track here. Let me continue. Or there's a Hungarian-born American theoretical physicist and also a Nobel laureate by the name of Eugene Wigner, who wrote a very famous paper entitled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And what struck him was how weird it was that mathematicians could sit in their studies inventing mathematical theorems and so on, imaginary numbers and so on, and then they would apply them to the universe. Why? Why is a creature who just evolved sort of randomly in the savannas of Africa or something like that, why do we even have to have minds, brains that can do this sort of thing? Why indeed? And why does the mathematics that we think of fit the universe? Why does it work in it? It's odd. It's very strange that it applies to the real outside world when, like Julian Jaynes postulates, the breakdown of the bicameral mind was just a historical transition that was the dawning of human consciousness when the brain went boom, and had a thought. In other words, the result of trillions of neurons firing off until they generated or oozed out a thought that says 1 and 1 equals 2. Wow! And from there, it just transitioned into the physics and mathematics we have today over millions of years of evolution, allowing mathematicians to sit in their studies, inventing mathematical theorems and so on. Imaginary numbers that they can apply to the universe and everything in it. All of this imagining math being an illusion too, right? An illusion? Come on, man. That's the end of the excerpts by Dr. Daniel Peterson. This talk by Dr. Peterson is basically a summary of what Professor Peterson says will become a 6-volume, maybe even a 7-volume series on the arguments he wanted to offer a friend who was going through a faith crisis and leaning towards atheism. Obviously, Dr. Peterson's first desire to help has grown and blossomed and become an enormous project. 7 volumes? Wow, that's one I'd want to get. Dr. Peterson's full talk goes into greater details on the arguments he gives on several topics that I've been covering as I've given my perspective on Richard's book, The God Delusion. At the end of his talk, Dr. Peterson included a lengthy list of footnotes and resources he used in writing his full talk. He's an intellectual, definitely those college professor brains are packed with stuff, and they follow all those steps and give all the footnotes and all the references, and it's packed. So I'm sure it's a very interesting book. Now you can check all of them out at www.fairlatterdaysaints.org under the title of The Reasonable Leap into Light, a bare-bones secular argument for the gospel. End quote. I'm hoping that what I've just covered shows you, my readers and my viewers, that there are most certainly 2 sides to every argument, probably more, regarding the God hypothesis theory, and any other topic for that matter. There's Richard's so-called scientific arguments against God's existence, and then there's my perspective and informed arguments, coupled with thousands of believing theist scientists' arguments for God's existence. There's the 2 sides. Each argument becomes another well-informed reference leg of evidence that you can add to your own table of beliefs support stand, which support stand, I've always said, has hopefully widened considerably as we've plowed through each chapter of Richard's book. And hopefully it has made your table of belief even more stable and fixed than it was before we began this journey together of reading the book or me doing these videos. The resources and references I listed in my introduction are just a drop in the bucket of the kind of support material I could have listed. There are hundreds of published accredited theist scientists, as well as expert intellectuals who've produced their own materials on this much-needed gap question. Richard supports one side of this debate and has his own list of accredited published atheist scientists whose research he has used to support his arguments against the much-needed gap question. After you, my viewers, have considered the arguments, interpretations, and perspectives from both sides of this does God exist debate, I'm confident you'll be able to make an informed, well-supported decision about which of the arguments, interpretations, and perspectives makes most sense to you, or more sense to you, and which of them aligns with your own mind and heart. In other words, which one feels right and actually moved your belief cursor the most as you've been reading and watching these videos. As you decide, hopefully you'll agree that the arguments that Richard has put forth, where he implies that they are settled science and falsifying the God hypothesis, that he in fact has not falsified the God hypothesis. I hope you realize that. The truth is, the jury is still out on that big question. Until the verdict comes back, we must continue deliberating on the data and continue seeking new and updated evidence to fill in and finish this question of this particular gap. It is my belief that by the time we're finished with this chapter and all the subtitles and my reviewing of them, I'm absolutely confident that my perspective on the God hypothesis will have enlightened your understanding as you consider each of my well-informed reference legs of evidence that I've shared with you already and will yet share with you with the remaining subtitles of this chapter. And from that understanding, it is my hope that your belief cursor will have moved closer and closer to the God exists marker on that percentage of probability spectrum. In fact, it is my hope that your belief cursor has in fact moved farther and farther away from the God does not exist marker. At least that's my hope. I can't help it, and that's because I love you and want the very best for all of you. For you are children of God. You are a child of God, and he loves you perfectly. There's a plan, there's a purpose, there's life after death, and therefore there's important things that we had to learn here. Okay, let's get on with the the first of the remaining subtitles. It's consolation. I'll do that on the next video. I just want to stop here and say this is the last chapter, and these are those four things that Richard's trying to prove. We're now going to talk about consolation. And listen to this, it's just mainly philosophical. It has nothing to do with science, but he still wants to cover it, so it's going to be an interesting conversation. And so until next time, I want you to write some comments down. I want you, if you're willing to, I'm asking you to subscribe. What helps get this algorithm going and sends it out to more folks, and there'll be more commentary and then questions. Please ask your questions and any thoughts you have. I'll do my best to get to them as quickly as I can. So until next time, I want to wish you continued success. Goodbye.